Hey friends, topic of the day, compassion. I've been thinking about compassion and where it can fit. Where can you fit compassion in your life, in your country? The reason I've been thinking about this is because I have been thinking about the United States and about the general culture of the United States from my perspective. I've only lived in a few states. I've lived in Idaho, Utah, and Georgia, and Tennessee. And I have lived for approximately a year and a half outside of the United States. So I have a little experience with living in Central America. And as I perceive the United States, it doesn't seem like there's a lot of space for compassion in the United States. I would think that there was more space in the United States for compassion than there was in Central America, for what I could see. And by compassion, I mean acts that allow you to be with passion, allow you to feel not just empathy, but allow you to work with people and have passion with people to help others, to literally give to others freely without expectations, which I think is rare. I think it's very rare. I think the United States, from what I can tell, is run ideologically. In other words, the ideas of this country are run on money. They're run on business. They're run on corporations. And I think that can be an interesting way to run a country. But I do think businesses run government more than government runs businesses. I could be wrong, but it does seem that way. It just seems like a lot of the ideas that rule our brains in the United States, and I'm not just talking about laws on the books, although obviously that's a manifestation of how we're all thinking, but I'm thinking about our brains, how we think. And I think a lot of people in the United States think in terms of money. And it makes me wonder where the spaces are in the United States for compassion. Some might say that they are in some businesses. That may be true. From what I've seen, there was one particular business I worked for that it was mid-sized business. Well, I shouldn't say mid-sized. It was when I left, I think it was nearing 300 people. So I don't know what that would be considered, but it was interesting because at that company it was just kind of like, when we needed to look good, it was just, I guess, charity, you could say, or acts of compassion with our means as a company were just something that it was like one little checkbox that you had to check off with all the other check boxes that had to be checked off. And there are many check boxes in a business. And so it was kind of a just check the box and do as little as possible type thing. There was definitely that feeling, and there was definitely, by the amount of resources that were put into it, it was definitely not at all important. It was just one of those things you have to do to look good as a business in this day and age. And I do think that's a reflection of the people in the United States. Um, but I also, more than that though, I do think that it's a reflection of the people, only because they've been they've been taught that that's what matters. It's almost as if United States citizens have been taught that what matters is business. And um, I think I think that we've been taught to be afraid of letting resources go. I think that we've been taught to be afraid of that unless it's going to turn into something, right? Thus you know, everyone wants to invest, and that's a investment is, I'm sure it's very interesting and it's a very good idea and it's very smart and all that. But I think in the United States we've lost this sense of not everything has to be an investment. Not everything needs to have a return. Not everything needs to have an interest rate associated with it. There is power in the idea of giving and not tracking the giving. There's a certain freedom in that, especially for the person who's receiving. They don't feel a burden to, they don't feel the quid pro quo burden, right? I was raised LDS Mormon. I was raised that way. It was very, um, I didn't think of it this way at the time, but it was very strict. It was very rule oriented. It was very checkbox oriented. There was a concept of spirit of the law versus letter of the law, but most of what we were doing, it was definitely letter of the law. And it was just very clear that me and my fellow family members and fellow Mormons were very concerned with checking off boxes. And I think I learned from my religion this quid pro quo, that in my religion there was a God, and this God not just expected you to be loving and kind and generous and all these things, which ironically we never really ended up being, I wouldn't say, as a group of Mormons. Um, but God also expected these things to occur so that you could be saved. You know, you had to get baptized, you had to get married in the temple, you needed to have kids, right? You needed to live a really, what we'd call a righteous life. And I think that translated for Mormons as a righteous life was going to church on Sunday, and it was going to conference every 6 months, and it was acts. It was acts that really have very little meaning. They could have some kind of meditative meaning if you were able within that environment to get there. But it wasn't really acts of goodness. There was no real inherent goodness there. Um, and so I think it's interesting just to think about, even within religions, and I don't know how all other religions really operate in the United States, But from my perspective, in my religion, it really was transactional. It was this, if you do these things, then God will do this. If you do this, God will do this. And um and your average Mormon will say, well, that's not true. You have to be a good person in your heart. But the reality is, there's just as much depression and there's just as much homelessness. There's just as much sadness in Utah and Idaho as there is anywhere else. So it doesn't really seem like many of these Mormons really know what they're talking about in terms of happiness or love or righteousness or anything like that. So it's kind of, I look back personally, I look back on it and it's this kind of empty experience because it was transactional, it was without heart. And um I'm just wondering where is the heart in the United States? Is it maybe in the film industry? There's some heart. Sometimes I see some heart in the film industry. Um, but where's the real compassion for there are those who are in need, and it wouldn't take much of what the United States has, and I'm not even talking about government, I'm talking about business. I'm talking about business primarily. But I'm also but even more than that, I'm talking about the mentality that's created businesses. Why is that mentality ruling the United States? Why is there a mentality that says transaction, 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 transaction? That's the mentality. Where is the mentality of I give a gift? And I'm sure this happens. I'm sure that there are people in the United States, maybe many of them. I bet there's businesses in the United States that give freely without, again, the quid pro quo. So I would love to hear more about those businesses because I would support them. I know that my means aren't much, but I think I think my mentality is different in a lot of ways. And I want to support those with this mentality of, hey, we don't have to live like this with this transactional and investment. We're putting 95% of our energy into transactions and investments. And, you know, I'm sure there's many people saying this, but why do you need to have $1 billion? It honestly, I figured out that I could pay my rent for 64,000 years with $1 billion. Why would you need $2 billion or $3 billion? Why would you need to pay an average rent for a two-person apartment or home? Why would you need to pay that for 150,000 years? The earth could literally be gone. And so I think there's this lack of proportion. Maybe we can do 80% investment in transactions and 20% real giving, and let's see how the world could change. Let's see how our minds could reshape if we're not constantly thinking again about transactions and investments. And investments are just a form of transactions. It's a machine-like type of thinking. It's a heartless type of thinking. And you know, I'm not a believer in the deity of Christ, but Christ talked about, and I know many people in the United States look up to Christ as a divinity, and it's odd that they look up to Christ as a divinity because Christ didn't seem that transactional, you know, and by his words in the New Testament, he didn't seem that transactional. He also talked about the body. He talked about the body of Christ, right? Or Paul, I believe, talked about the body of Christ. How, and I don't think Jesus Christ himself in the New Testament talked about the body of Christ. I do believe it was Paul. So I want to just make sure that's clear that I'm saying that. But to me, it's, the United States is only thinking in one small part of the brain, one small part of the prefrontal cortex on the left side. If you want to think about it that way, we're just thinking transactionally for the most part. And I think our culture and our country and our businesses would be much, much healthier if we kind of pulled in some heart. What does it mean to fill a little bit more with your heart? It means you're not transactional. It means one doesn't equal one. One doesn't always equal one in the heart. One equals one in the brain, but it doesn't always equal one in the heart. The heart is a different organ. It has a different energy to it, if you want to use that term. It has a different way of being, right? We all know people who who lead themselves more with their brain. Great. We all know people who lead themselves more with their heart. And those who lead themselves more with their heart are often considered less valuable in our culture. And that's really sad, because there's more to life and there's more to the human race than people who lead themselves with their brain. There's a lot of other people and a lot of other personalities and a lot of other virtues that have nothing to do with proper transactional and business-like thinking. See you next time.